Thank you. It's really actually kind of strange to be back here. It's been a very, very long time since I was here, but you know, one thinks about all those brown bag talks that I used to go to when I was a student here between 1990 and 1996, it brings back a lot of memories to be here now. Although now that I think about it, the building is actually a lot different, and the room is different actually. I don't recognize that many people. And actually, I'm a good deal older. And they're actually recording this. But aside from that, aside from the building, the audience, the room, the fact that they're filming this at my age, it feels exactly the same as it would have in 1993 or 1994. And I want to thank Ron also for that very, very nice introduction, too. It's really, truly a pleasure to be back here. The talk I'm going to do today really has to do, I suppose, with empire. It has to do with religion. It has to do with the intersection of foreign and domestic policies. And it's about borders, and I suppose you could say their transgression. And my point of departure in this is a curiosity of nomenclature pertaining to the religious diversity of the Russian Empire in the 19th century. Namely that I'm referring here to the fact that Imperial Russia's non-Orthodox faiths and denominations were referred to collectively as the foreign confessions, or the иностранные исповедания. And let's see if I can figure out how to do this. I probably should have figured this out ahead of time. Right, if you don't believe me, here's a title or a segment from the internal correspondence of the department in Russian. It was part of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, this department that had jurisdiction over this, but you can see the Департамент духовных дел и иностранных исповеданий, or the Department of the Religious Affairs of the Foreign Confessions. And my argument here is pretty straightforward, namely that in crucial respects, the religious dimension of Imperial Russian history is an international, or I suppose you could say transnational story, involving communities, institutions, and polities beyond Russia's borders. And conversely, the history of Russia as an empire, a topic that I think still has a bit of mileage on it still, is in part a story of the ways in which internal and foreign policy imperatives of St. Petersburg intersected and diverged over issues with a distinctly religious hue. So my goal then here is to highlight the ways in which Russian imperial history was entangled with that of neighboring Eurasian polities, from Mongolia to Norway. Actually, I don't have any concrete examples from Norway, but ask me, I can give you some, with specific reference to spiritual questions or religious institutions. And to an extent, I suppose maybe my central propositions might be familiar to some degree to some people with respect to orthodoxy itself. People probably know or may know about Russia's support for, and one could say maybe exploitation of, Balkan Orthodox communities in the 19th century, at least since the Treaty of Küçük-Kaynarca with the Ottomans in 1774. Some people may be well aware that Russia's imperial interests in Syria and Palestine and the implication of orthodoxy in that matter was also an important issue in the 19th century. But I suspect that probably matters are less familiar when we turn to these non-Orthodox religions, these so-called foreign confessions. And here I propose, I suppose, that we take seriously this designation of these religions as foreign confessions. This designation was introduced, as far as I can tell, in around 1810 for reasons that are not entirely clear to me, though I can speculate if anybody wants me to do so. I think it's a curious designation for at least two reasons. First of all, Russia construed itself as a multinational empire rather than a nation state. So the question immediately arises, why would the government identify religions of its own subjects explicitly as foreign? And secondly, the state at this particular moment, around 1810, was precisely beginning the process, or was in the midst of the process, of attempting to, what I would call domesticate these non-Orthodox faiths. That is, to establish crucial elements of state institutional oversight and regulation. So given that project, why would statesmen render permanently alien the religions that they were trying to integrate into a rational imperial system? Yet this designation, for all of its strangeness along those lines, it seems to me has a certain foundation, because it seems to me that it captures an important characteristic of those religions, namely that their principal spiritual centers and the bulk of their adherents were indeed located beyond Russia's borders. And so it's in this sense that I think we need to take the designation of the foreign confessions seriously. So what I'd like to do is precisely that, to contemplate the implications of this foreignness and the manner in which this was in some ways central to Russia's imperial character. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to proceed in the following fashion. First of all, I'll identify particular ways in which the foreignness of the foreign confessions could manifest itself, giving a few examples from a wide range of spiritual traditions in Russia, including Ran, the Armenians. This brief survey reveals, I think, that certain episodes and processes in the religious history of the Russian Empire were actually centered beyond the borders of the country. Second, I'll consider the ways in which these foreign connections not only confronted the imperial state with challenges and dangers, but also created important opportunities. Opportunities that reveal, I think, a certain distinct utilitarianism in ruling imperial circles, whatever the regime's specific ideological commitment to orthodoxy. I should emphasize here that this is a talk basically, in essence, based on the research of colleagues as well as myself, and I can identify some of the particular people more explicitly should anybody want to do that. I'll not make a point of that here today. So let me then turn to the specific manifestations of foreignness of the foreign confessions. And here I'm just going to sketch out basically a number of ways in which these foreign connections could actually existed and actually could be established, and then I'll contemplate some of the ways in which this is important. First of all, I'll point to pilgrimage. This was one of a major religious practice that actually required believers often to traverse the borders of the Russian Empire. I'm not sure if I have some good maps here. It's very, very hard to find good maps that include Russia and the Middle East. Actually, good maps generally are hard to find, I think. Accurate, good historical maps are very difficult to find. So I've done the best I can with this one here. But you'll see that you can see the basic possible routes that that pilgrims might take, for example, if they were going from various places in Russia to Mecca, let's say. So Muslims performing the Hajj to Mecca was one important site of pilgrimage. Jews, Karaites, and Orthodox Christians as well strove often to visit Jerusalem or other locations in the Holy Land. Many Catholics sought to visit Rome, that being the important center. If we turn to, well, that map I guess I can come back to. Well, there's Rome. Yes, you know it. If we turn to basically Siberia, Buddhists in Mongolia, around Lake Baikal, they often sought to go across the border into Mongolia. The city is not indicated here. It was known as Urga back then. Now it's known as Ulaanbaatar. That is the capital of Mongolia, but it was an important Buddhist site, and Buryats and other Buddhists from Russia would often seek to go there. And in a few cases, one can even point to, maybe I can go back to this, one can even point to a couple of sites within Russia to which pilgrims from abroad came. One of them would be Częstochowa, basically in the Kingdom of Poland, not too far basically from the Austrian border. And another case would be Echmiadzin, that is a central site for the Armenians. And Armenians would sometimes come from abroad to visit that site, that monastery, after it had been incorporated in Russia in 1828. So the pilgrimage is one way in which we see these transnational connections. Education was another way, another foundation or basis for cross-border interaction. I think one can say that the Russian Empire was fairly well outfitted with educational institutions in terms of preparation of Orthodox clergy. But once one turns to non-Orthodox clergy, the situation gets a little bit more complicated. There are some institutions in Russia, but not so very many. There was only one institution, for example, in Russia that was Dorpat University, now Tartu, that prepared Protestant pastors for the empire. So many aspiring pastors would also seek education in some of the major Protestant centers in Germany, for example, and other countries. Muslims had various madrasas in Russia, some of them quite prestigious, but this did not seek Muslims from often seeking educational opportunities outside of Russia, whether in the Ottoman Empire or, for example, in Bukhara before that territory was incorporated into Russia. A related issue of cross-border trade, once again, between Tibet or Mongolia and Russia, a cross-border trade in books. This was also an important issue that arose on various occasions over the course of the 19th century. And of course, education abroad affected not only the people who actually received that education, but also other people in local communities, particularly if those people being educated were religious servitors. In many cases, foreign subjects were actually recruited specifically to fulfill clerical vacancies in Russia. Many of the Protestant pastors for German colonists in the south of Russia, if I can go back to maybe this original map here, basically along the lower Volga, in New Russia, around Odessa. A lot of those clerical servitors were recruited from abroad, frequently from the Basel Missionary Institute in Switzerland. With the expulsion of Jesuits from Russia in 1820, many Catholic servitors were also brought in from abroad, particularly from Bavaria. The idea here was to get non-Polish Catholic servitors, preferably. In the 19th century, several of the figures who became the head of the Armenian Church, that is the Catholicos, those also came to that position as Ottoman subjects, although they were naturalized as Russian subjects. That is, they took the oath of subjecthood to the Russian emperor when they occupied that position. And between the Polish insurrection of 1863 and the elimination of the Uniate Church in 1875, St. Petersburg actively recruited Uniate clergy from Austrian Galicia, in large measure because that clergy was less pro-Polish than the existing clergy. So in short, foreign lands actually served as an important source, an important resource of religious servitors for Russia. Another interesting area, it has to do with foreign missionaries. Despite the fact that ostensibly Russia granted a monopoly on proselytism to the Orthodox Church, at various times, in fact, there were numerous foreign missionaries working on Russian soil, that is, representing non-Orthodox religions. This was often because they had linguistic or technical skills that Russian and Orthodox missionaries lacked. Thus, we see in the South Caucasus, there were Scottish missionaries who were Presbyterians. The London Missionary Society maintained a missionary presence among the Buryats for about 2 decades in the early 18th century. And most strikingly, the London Missionary Society also had an effort to convert Jews to Christianity in the Kingdom of Poland in the later 19th century, which I actually find a kind of striking, really quite a striking fact that the Russian Empire allowed this. I still haven't quite understood why exactly they did this, even having consulted archival files on it in St. Petersburg this last summer. Another source of foreign connections has to do with religious innovation, above all new religions. These often did and did come from abroad. This was critical for Orthodoxy itself. If one thinks about the trajectory of the development of Orthodoxy in the 17th century, the important Ukrainian influence that one sees at that time and in later years too. The Baptist faith made its way into Russia, or probably more specifically into Ukraine, through German settlers who maintained connections with their homeland and also an important Baptist spiritual center in Hamburg, which was then outfitting them with books and teachers. Books from South Dakota and Kansas, again coming through German settler intermediaries, was an important source of the appearance of Seventh-day Adventism in Russia towards the end of the 19th century. And Protestantism also appeared among Armenians, too, in the South Caucasus as a result of contacts with external religious agents, some of them American missionaries or British missionaries coming across the border from the Ottoman Empire, but also longer-term connections with Basel and Switzerland, which was providing local servitors to German colonists in the region. It's safe to say that the numbers of people adhering to these new religions was not particularly great, but they're important, I think, because Russia's confessional order was really not well suited to deal with the appearance of new religions, and considerable conflict developed in many of these communities when new religions appeared, and these had to be regulated and they had to be adjudicated. Finally, maybe the most striking example of cross-border connections has to do with the very fact of spiritual authority. And I think of at least 2 instances where the spiritual authority of a particular figure, a particular religious head, actually traversed the borders of the Russian Empire. In one case, this involved a figure residing outside of Russia whose authority was projected inward, that is, into Russia, and that's, of course, the Pope in Rome. And the other was a figure within Russia, at least after 1828, whose authority extended outward to other countries, eventually as far flung as Worcester, Massachusetts, and Fresno, California, and this was the Armenian Catholicos, who was situated in Echmiadzin. So in these 2 cases, the religious affairs of Armenians and Catholics could in no way be regarded as a strictly internal matter, and this was even reflected in Russia's own law codes, if you look at them. For example, the statute on the Armenian Church of 1836 took explicit account of this foreign dimension and even allowed for the participation of foreign Armenian delegates in the election of the Catholicos. They also made it a point of translating that statute into Armenian immediately and transmitting it to Armenians in Constantinople almost as soon as it had been completed, because they recognized that it had international significance. On the Catholic side, efforts to bring Catholic affairs into order in a kind of czarist sense within Russia. As a result of this, St. Petersburg was compelled to enter into diplomatic relations with the Holy See. And the most important, I suppose, artifact in this process was the Concordat they signed with Rome in 1847, which many statutes of which, or many provisions of which, actually made their way into internal Russian law, which is a relatively unique occurrence, I think, particularly for an autocratic regime, one could say. No doubt there are other foreign connections one could point to. Probably there are some that people here know of which I'm unaware. I'd be happy to hear about them. But I think this brief excursion is enough to establish that the religious affairs of Imperial Russia were situated in a geographical field that encompassed a swath of Eurasia extending well beyond the country's borders, and in fact extended, in many cases, to the United States even, at least in some respects. Okay. What then are the implications of this? What are the implications of the situation that I've described, of the fact that there are these foreign connections? I suppose it might be tempting to suppose that imperial statesmen were generally anxious about these foreign connections and actively sought to isolate its subjects from contact with co-religionists abroad, maybe with the possible exception of Orthodox ones. There's some truth to this supposition, as we'll see here in a moment. But if these foreign connections presented certain dangers and challenges, they also furnished governing elites with valuable tools, especially in the realm of foreign policy. That is, these foreign confessions, precisely because they were foreign in a crucial sense, provided a unique set of opportunities that might be skillfully exploited by a wise Latina, imperial great power. All right, didn't work. I have in my notes, pause for raucous laughter. I think I'll just scratch that out. This combination of danger and opportunity, and the Tsarist government's recognition of it, suggests that we should see the state as utilitarian and sufficiently perceptive to detect real benefits of its multi-confessional subject population, even if it was not always able to exploit these opportunities effectively. So let me first of all consider attempts to break foreign connections, because I think there are such attempts, and I think they're worthy of being registered. One cannot deny that an important principle of Imperial Russian spiritual administration was an aspiration for autocephaly. That is, the attempt to erect independent spiritual authority within the borders of the Russian Empire for the subjects of the Tsar. This, after all, had been a major achievement for the Orthodox Church itself, whether you count it from 1448 or whether from 1589. For the non-Orthodox faiths, this process occurred considerably later, not least of all because some of these populations were only annexed later. And it really dates, I think, primarily to the age of Catherine II, maybe a little bit later too. Perhaps most famously, in 1788, Catherine established the Orenburg Muslim Spiritual Assembly with its own mufti, partly in order to block the pretensions of the Ottoman Sultan as the caliph to the allegiances of Russian Muslims. A similar logic pertained at the same to institutional construction of Muslim institutions in the Crimea at roughly the same time. And the aspiration to segregate Shia Muslims of the South Caucasus off from mujtahids in Iran was also central to the full state institutionalization of Islam in that region in 1872. Actually, some images I probably should have been giving you earlier that I've forgotten about in my excitement. This is Echmiadzin, the site of the Catholicos, or the seat of the Catholicos in Armenia. This is the Kingdom of Poland, and basically the Austrian territory to the south, which is the place, Austrian Galicia, from which Russia was drawing servitors for the Uniate Church. The best map I could find shows the insurrection of 1863, which is convenient because this policy was in large measure a response precisely to that event. The Pope, this is Pope Pius IX, who signed the Concordat with Russia in 1847. This is one of the Catholicoses, or Catholicoi, I guess is the plural of that, Mirketic at the end of the 19th century. And this is Tivkaliev, one of the Orenburg muftis from the 1860s, as I recall. He was appointed in 1862, I think, if my memory serves me correctly. And this was the map I was sort of driving towards. It's an interesting confessional map of the South Caucasus. And here you can see that sort of pale green are Shia Muslims. And one can see that the Shia Muslim community, of course, extends then into Iran, and part of the issue of establishing institutions there in the South Caucasus in 1872 was to prevent or to limit, certainly to limit, if not to sever entirely, the connections between those communities within Russia and those in Iran. And likewise, for Buddhists in eastern Siberia, the closing of the border to Mongolia was a crucial factor in the elevation of one figure, one lama. He became known as the Bandido Hamba Lama I'm not making this up, yes, no, it's true, at a place called Goose Lake, Gusinskaya Ozera, in around 1764. There are different dates that I've seen for this, but basically one figure was elevated, and he was designed to represent an alternative to a figure known as the Khutakht, or Khutukta in Russian, which was the central Buddhist figure in Mongolia and was below only the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama in the Tibetan hierarchy. So the idea was to establish basically a figure at home, an indigenous figure, who could basically serve as the source or the focal point of religious allegiances, as opposed to those allegiances going across the borders. And Catherine II strove to extend this even to Catholics. She established a figure known as the Metropolitan of all Catholics, sought to maximize the figure, the authority of that figure, established something known as the Roman Catholic College, which was a Catholic counterpart to the Orthodox Holy Synod in 1801. That was designed explicitly as an administration, quote, without the influence of any alien power. So you can definitely see, if you look at what the Russian Empire is doing, particularly in the late 18th century into the 19th century, there are clear and distinct attempts to sever religious authority or religious connections going across the borders of the Russian Empire, and in particular to establish indigenous sources of religious authority. This is all very true, and it's all very important, and it needs to be registered. But we would be amiss, I think, if we were to leave things there, and if we were to fail to recognize a more complex, and I would argue a much more interesting picture. And we might begin simply by recognizing that the aspirations that we've just described were not always successful, and that the regime was compelled to live with some of the cross-border connections that it had sought to sever or to destroy. And Roman Catholicism is the best example here. The efforts to bring Catholic affairs into greater order without the Pope almost always ran into serious difficulties. Sooner or later, the regime found itself constantly coming back to the Holy See on several occasions, since the basic task, even of filling episcopal vacancies, was utterly impossible without Rome's participation. And Rome was willing to recognize this Roman Catholic College only when St. Petersburg actually divested it of virtually all of its spiritual authority and made it simply a strictly administrative body, and not a very significant one, one could add. Nor, one should add, did the imperial state try to break cross-border religious ties in all cases. The quintessential case here that I can think of is the Armenian Catholicos I referred to earlier. Imperial statesmen were astutely conscious of the potential benefits of having the spiritual head of this church within Russia while retaining spiritual authority over Armenians abroad, enhancing the authority of that Catholicos in Turkey, especially among the influential Armenian community in Constantinople, became a central goal of St. Petersburg's Armenian religious policy, even, I would argue, at the expense of its policy with regard to that church inside the Russian Empire. Right? See, Ron, we did do it. I did do it. I did do the Armenian stuff, right? It's interesting that I came to this after I left here.
Don't blame me. I was gone by then.
Yeah, right. I wonder how one could understand that and explain that. It's very curious. Probably not good to think about it too much, though. And not in the middle of a talk, moreover. It's interesting to know that this perspective did not pertain only to the Armenian confession, though. And I just came across this one thing. It was a plan that nothing ever came of it, but I just thought it was interesting, and I have to mention it. In 1858, there was this official in, I believe he was in the Ministry of Internal Affairs, came up with this proposal to create in Russia what he called, quote, a kind of Jewish papacy designed to attract the allegiance of Jews throughout the entire world. Now, admittedly, this idea was rejected because the hierarchical principle didn't really apply to Judaism, but I think this episode shows that some statesmen were thinking explicitly in terms of creating imperial Russian religious institutions with an international scope, even if not in all cases they were able to realize it, or if it not in all cases made sense at that particular moment. In some cases, we see that the state actually simply accepts foreign connections with relatively little demur. An interesting example in this regard involves requests by foreign pastors, most of them German, to visit the empire and to preach sermons to various communities of Protestants in various cities here and there. And such requests were almost always accepted, or generally accepted, as long as a community in Russia was actually inviting that person, and truly, in other words, truly wanted that preacher to be there, and as long as local Protestant bodies were not in opposition to it. But most amazingly in this case was that permission was being given to German pastors as late as the 13th of July, 1914, by the Julian calendar, which means literally like a couple of days before the mobilization leading to the First World War. And only right after that do they begin to say, in light of the war with Germany, probably having German pastors here is not a good idea. But up until the last moment, they're saying, the Department of Foreign Confessions is saying, we see no problem with this, as long as the visas, as long as the passport's in order, no difficulty at all. I think you can also say that the ability of statesmen to perceive opportunity in foreign religious connections is discernible in other cases as well. I mentioned this case earlier. In the 1860s and 70s, the imperial government was eager to recruit Uniate clergy from Austrian Galicia. And this was precisely because that clergy was more Russophile, or at least perceived to be more Russophile, and more anti-Polish than the Uniate clergy located within the Russian Empire, or the Kingdom of Poland within Russia, that is under Romanov rule. So this foreign clergy represented a valuable resource in resolving religious questions within Russia's borders. This foreign Uniate clergy was potentially more reliable politically than clerics who were already Russian subjects. And a young scholar, Eileen Kane, who's I think at Connecticut College, has demonstrated that St. Petersburg was far from hostile to Muslim pilgrimage to Mecca, and even supported those travels with transport and consular services. This was based on St. Petersburg's recognition of the connections of Russia's Muslims to those elsewhere as a potential strategic asset, one that could enhance Russia's position in the competition with other European powers for influence in Ottoman Syria and Palestine. And I'll add here that some officials also recognized that directing the traffic of Central Asian pilgrims to Mecca through Russia, here I should probably go back to this, maybe this first map here. Yeah, which one? Which one's? We'll use this one here. If you can imagine, Central Asia up there on the other side of the Aral Sea, basically, the idea was that if they could direct the traffic not through Iran, where it was traditionally going, but through across the Caspian, and then through the South Caucasus, and then through by steamship down towards what's now Saudi Arabia, down towards Mecca, they realized that they could actually instigate economic development of the South Caucasus. So it was a recognition that this traffic in pilgrims actually provided a potential economic benefit if the Russian Empire could actually manage to exploit that possibility. It's striking with regard to Eastern Siberia, and maybe I can get this map. The best one I found was in Chinese, so that actually shows these territories well. It's really hard to find good maps. You'll recall I mentioned a moment ago that there was this attempt to break connections between Buddhists within Russia and those abroad, yet by the time we get to the late 19th or early 20th century, one begins to see the opposite. That is that St. Petersburg is actively supporting the possibility of Russian Buddhists to maintain ties with Lhasa, that is the Tibetan capital, and to undertake pilgrimages to that city. In this case, the proposition was that Russia's Buddhists could serve as a valuable asset in preventing the establishment of a British protectorate over Tibet, and that was the fear at the time. And St. Petersburg actually insisted on this principle, on the inclusion of this principle, that is the right of Russian Buddhists to visit Lhasa, and the right of unrestricted relations of Russian Buddhists with the Dalai Lama, quote, on religious grounds, in a convention that it signed with Great Britain in 1907. It's also worth noting that a Russian subject, a Buryat by the name of Agvan Dorjiev, occupied a prominent place in the inner circle of the 13th Dalai Lama, that is, around the turn of the century. All right, what can we say in conclusion? What can we conclude from this wide-ranging, if cursory, excursion around and across the borders of the Russian Empire? Was there any logic to the principles behind the state's attitude towards cross-border religious connections? And I'd offer here a few provisional thoughts, I suppose with the caveat that I really think we actually need more research on these issues to produce a clearer picture. First, it seems to me that attitudes were shaped in part by institutional interests within the Tsarist autocracy. And here, because I don't have a lot of time, I'll simplify savagely and just suggest that the foreign ministry, which was concerned, of course, primarily with projecting Russian power abroad, outward, was more inclined to see opportunities in foreign religious connections, whereas the internal ministries, above all the Ministry of Internal Affairs itself, was more inclined to see danger, or at least to be wary of foreign religious connections. And so there was a constant struggle between these two sides to establish an ideal balance, one that's revealed very, very nicely, I think, in the case of the Armenian Catholicos over the course of the 19th century, where the balance is changing, and it's a very, very interesting, dynamic. Second, I would posit a certain diachronic dimension informing state attitudes about foreign religious connections. This aspiration to autocephaly that I mentioned earlier, and thus to severing ties, these kinds of connections where they existed, was strongest, I think, under Catherine II and perhaps in the early decades of the 19th century. And this makes sense because it was at that time Russia had only recently annexed many of the religious communities in question from foreign lands and was engaged in the larger projects of institutional construction for their religious needs. And this kind of assimilation to the Russian imperial order, of these foreign religions to the Russian imperial order, would be facilitated, it was believed, by autocephaly. That is, without external authorities that could more openly contest this or that dimension of specifically Tsarist forms of confessional regulation. Later in the imperial period, the regime seems to have been more inclined to see the benefits of foreign connections than it had been earlier. By this time, the state had largely, though by no means completely, domesticated the foreign confessions in institutional and statutory forms. Russia was also now in much more intense imperialist competition with other great powers, and the capacity of neighboring states, such as China and the Ottoman Empire, to withstand European encroachments was increasingly in doubt. So in other words, there was a sense that there could be cataclysmic or large-scale change in places like China and the Ottoman Empire, and Russia needed to deploy all of its resources for the purposes of occupying a good position should those events occur, or when they would occur, when the Ottoman Empire would collapse, for example. The rise of the national idea, on the other hand, of nationalism and nationalist sentiment, and the close connection between the national idea and religious conceptions, this created a kind of countervailing force. So one sees, on the one hand, a tendency towards valuing these foreign connections in light of this international competition, but the danger of nationalist challenge to the integrity of the empire creates a countervailing force, so that the state was more inclined, in some instances, to be more careful about this. And I think we really need more empirical research, good old-fashioned empirical research, to be able to establish, what this balance actually is over the course of the 19th century and into the 20th. Third, I suppose there's some evidence that we could make a distinction perhaps between what I would call stigmatized religions and ones considered politically safer. So there were always fears about Catholicism for historical, theological, and I suppose nationalist reasons as well. But even here we need some caveats. The first is the fact that the level of stigmatization changed over the course of the 19th century. The Armenian Church is a good example of this. It was considered to be a politically safe church early on, and it was much more questioned later on in the 19th century. On the other hand, stigmatized religions could be the ones whose foreign connections were the most difficult to manage, and the Catholics here again are a good example of this. On the third hand, or on the one foot, I suppose, because we only have two hands, most of us anyway. Ultimately, the imperial regime was inclined to view religions, the foreign confessions included, I would say, as allies in the maintenance of the empire's order and stability. This is an argument that was made recently by Robert Cruz. And this was true even of those religions, I think, that seemed politically worrisome. And so from this perspective, the big challenge was always to distinguish purely spiritual affairs, or чисто духовные дела in Russian, which were legitimate and warranted protection, from the political exploitation of religious institutions, for example, by nationalist elites, which could be restricted legitimately from the standpoint of the Russian Empire. In the end, I suppose I'm inclined to stress the situational and, wait for it, Ron, wait for it, the contingent. You like that word, don't you? Yeah, the contingent character of the state's position on foreign religious ties. These ties were in large measure the product of historical trajectories and theological principles specific to each confession or to each region in the empire. And so the opportunities and dangers that they represented had above all to do with the challenges facing the empire, both internally and externally, at any particular moment, and of course, the suppositions and presuppositions with which statesmen approach these problems and their own prejudices and concepts. In this regard, drawing broad, overarching conclusions is difficult, as this does too much violence, I think, to historical specificity. So my aspirations here today have been somewhat more modest. I would say that I will have succeeded if I've been able to convince you, even partially, that Rome, the Holy Land, Urga, Hamburg, Paris, Constantinople, Lhasa, Eastern Galicia, and even South Dakota, all of these were significant sites in the religious history of Imperial Russia, and that Imperial Russia's so-called foreign confessions really were, in an important way, foreign. Thank you.